Good morning. It's a little rainy out there, but we'll get started. Welcome to the 2017 Iowa City Book Festival, presented by the Iowa City UNESCO City of Literature. We would like to thank the sponsors who made this event possible: the City of Iowa City, the University of Iowa, the Iowa Arts Council, the Iowa City Coralville Convention and Visitors Bureau, Iowa Public Radio, and the Tuesday Agency. If you don't have a program, there are programs over here for the entire festival and nice little bookmarks. Between events, you can visit the book fair at Merge, and if you don't know where Merge is, it's right on the other side of the playground. If you go out this exit for the library, it'll be straight ahead of you and to the right. And there you can shop with authors, artists, booksellers, and more. And there's also complimentary coffee from local roaster Wake Up Iowa City. The vast majority of the book festival events are offered without charge, but they are not free. Your tax-deductible donation gives us the ability to offer programs like this festival. Please consider supporting the City of Literature by texting the word book to 319-774-7669 and follow the link. Today we will hear from authors Ted Genoways, Kathryn Gamble, and Barbara Hall. I'm going to introduce Ted, and later on Maeve will introduce Kathryn and Barbara. And there will be time for questions at the end if you want to ask some questions. Ted Genoways is an acclaimed journalist and author of This Blessed Earth, A Year in the Life of an American Family Farm. A contributing editor at Mother Jones, The New Republic, and Pacific Standard, he is the winner of a National Press Club Award and the James Aronson Award for Social Justice Journalism, and is a two-time James Beard Foundation Award finalist. He has received fellowships from the NEA and the Guggenheim Foundation. A fourth-generation Nebraskan, Genoways lives outside Lincoln with his wife, Mary Ann Andre, and their son. Please welcome Ted Genoways.
That is in fact working. Thanks very much for coming out on such a rainy morning, and thanks to everyone at the book festival for having me, and to my fellow panelists. I also have to say there's nothing quite like having your teenage son in the audience, so that when someone describes you as an acclaimed journalist, you can look out at him smirking back at you. So I will do my best to try to seem worthy of that, even if he doesn't agree. So somewhere about 10 or 12 years ago, there was a kind of unexpected consumer movement that emerged in America. After decades of our enthusiasm for canned food, frozen food, fast food, microwavable food, really any food that made cooking swifter or easier or completely unnecessary, suddenly American diners started rejecting prepackaged meals and found themselves instead looking for something that would be more sustainable, something that would be something that they felt at ease and comfortable putting on their family's dinner table. Much of this was kind of inspired by Eric Schlosser's Fast Food Nation and Michael Pollan's Omnivore's Dilemma, and countless other books and movies that were sort of paddling in their wake, including some of my own work. Out of this emerged a number of food movements, and I'm sure you all know them. The slow food movement, the eat local movement, the organic movement, the fair trade movement, the food justice movement. Among the accomplishments of that sort of new food revolution was bringing insider terms like high fructose corn syrup and lean, finely textured beef and genetically modified organism, not only into the common lexicon, but into the center of our debates about how our food should be raised and how government should support the production of that food. Most of all, I would say that at long last, we started to have a conversation about how it was that agriculture had been turned into agribusiness while much of the country was not really paying attention. But a few years ago, my wife and I, Marianne, who is also here, as we did a lot of ag reporting together, began to wonder whether this food revolution was really helping family farmers. We wanted to know how they felt about a food movement that suddenly lionized ideologically driven producers like Joel Salatin, whose Polyphase Farms was highlighted in Michael Pollan's The Omnivore's Dilemma, but often vilified generations-old operations in the middle of the country where many farmers have no choice but to raise commodity grains just to stay afloat. So we found ourselves looking for a family that we thought would highlight some of these issues and would allow us to explore these topics in an extended project. And it was at that point that Marianne had the idea of following Rick Hammond here and his family as their operation was in the midst of the transition period known as succession, with Rick who had married into a fifth-generation operation decades before, was preparing to hand the operation over to his 4 kids. And the first of them, Megan, who Marianne knew especially well, was in the process of starting to take over her portion of the farm along with her then fiance, now husband, Kyle Galloway. We wanted to talk to them in part because they embodied a number of issues at a kind of key moment. And I want to start by just reading a bit from the introduction that explains where they were at the moment that they agreed to have us follow them around. I should say, this started out with Marianne saying to Megan, can I follow, she was asking, can I follow you around and take photographs of you for a year? And Megan agreed, and then I said, that would be a great book. And the Hammonds were quite generous in allowing me to come along as well. Marianne was generous in allowing me to come along to not only document them visually, as you can see, but to also delve into some of the complexity of what was going on with the family at that moment. So I'll start with part of the introduction. At the end of June 2014, crop counters at the U.S. Department of Agriculture had released estimates that the summer's mild weather and increased rainfall would mean a much higher than expected yield. It's the kind of prediction that sounds like good news, but for farmers, it meant an upcoming glut of grain. One report projected that the national soybean yield would be 3.3 million acres higher than expected at planting, not just cutting into profits, but actually outstripping domestic demand. The outlook for corn was little better. Though acres planted to feed corn were down, the stockpiled reserves from the record yield of 2013 remained at an all-time high. On news of such unprecedented surpluses, corn and soybean futures nosedived among speculators at the Chicago Board of Trade. After several years of riding high on $8 corn, farmers watched prices fall to $3.50 per bushel. Soybeans, which had topped $17, dropped below $10. Then in August, in the weeks just before harvest, a series of downpours moved across the middle of Nebraska, dumping 2 and 3 inches at a time. Pushing back the start date, for bringing in the beans. While Kyle and Dave waited anxiously, Dave is the farm's hired man. While they waited anxiously for fields to dry enough that a harvester wouldn't mire in the mud, projections for the national yield kept going up and up. Every day that the crop stayed out, unharvested and undelivered to the co-op, the per bushel prices went lower. For weeks in nearby towns, at the firehouse in Hordeville, in the bar in Polk, even at the Iron Skillet at the truck stop south of York, the talk had turned to the Jews in Chicago making bank on the backs of farmers. Kyle didn't have time for that. He rolled his eyes and shook his head at the old-timers who were drinking coffee and bullshitting instead of doing what they could to cut their losses. Kyle didn't own the acreage just south of the Platte River in east central Nebraska, but his girlfriend, Megan Hammond, was part of the sixth generation of her family to live and farm in that area. And Megan and Kyle were starting to talk about a wedding in the next year. Once that happened, Megan's father, Rick, figured it would be time to give them a stronger hand in the operation. Whenever people ask Rick what he raised on the farm, he always responded, corn and cattle and kids. By the end of the year, if all went as planned, Megan and Kyle wouldn't be kids anymore. But handing over control of the operation, succession as it's known, is one of the hardest times in the life of any family farm. The older generation always struggles to let go of the reins, to trust their kids to carry forward a long and fragile tradition. The younger generation bridles against the meddling and second-guessing and feels the double weight of scrutiny and doubt in every misstep. Many farms don't officially change hands until the older generation dies, leaving the rising generation beholden to their parents until well into adulthood and often into their 50s or 60s. It breeds resentment and too often divides generations or turns brothers and sisters against each other. It is so stressful and legally complex that there are psychiatrists and attorneys alike who build whole practices around helping families navigate the process. But on the Hammond farm, it was even more complex. And I'll skip ahead to explain, because I do think it's important to know that part of the way that we found them and that additional complexity was that the particular piece of ground that the Hammonds are farming, or several pieces that are constellated around the original farmstead, are still slated to be crossed by the Keystone XL pipeline. So skipping ahead, that pipeline project, intended to carry heavy crude pumped from the Alberta tar sands in Canada nearly 2,000 miles to Port Arthur and Houston on the Texas Gulf Coast, was slated to cut through their land. Megan and Rick vehemently opposed the project, arguing that it would not only further slash their crop production, but that it posed an existential threat to the Ogallala Aquifer, the underground reservoir of fresh water that they depend on to irrigate crops and water their cattle. Rick even agreed to let the anti-pipeline nonprofit group Bold Nebraska build a solar-powered barn, the so-called energy barn, on land he rented from his in-laws. The publicity had brought in an unexpected amount of national press, culminating in Willie Nelson and Neil Young joining forces with Bold to mount the fundraising Harvest the Hope concert in the cleared cornfield of Art Tandrip, a farmer near Neely, Nebraska, whose land was also threatened by the pipeline. But unpublicized amid all the hoopla was the reality that the barn, built in the middle of a productive piece of farmland, had cost Rick still more precious acres of ground, where he had planned to plant soybeans that year. Worse still was a letter that arrived soon after from one of Rick's neighbors. He had rented hundreds of acres to Rick for many years, but now, in protest, was pulling out of that long-standing agreement, a move that was likely to cost the Hammonds between $150,000 and $200,000 of gross income for the coming year. The cancellation letter made no bones about the reasons. I'm sorry to inform you that your outspoken endorsement of defeating the Keystone Pipeline is not in our common interest. So I'll just skip ahead to the beginning of the harvest and there. But the key thing is that going into that harvest season, the Hammonds were really quite courageous in what they allowed us to do. When they agreed in May of 2014 to allow us to follow them for a year, starting at the harvest, the prices were roughly twice what they were by the fall, when we actually showed up, and the mood was tense, and everything was riding on having everything go right. And of course, on the farm, as in life in general, not everything ever goes right. This is the beginning of the harvest season. This is called bringing out the beans. The bright green hulk of our John Deere harvester crept across the field of soybeans. It was late in the day, early October, the sun low. A cloud of hulls and chaff spewed from the back of the combine, then swirled up around us and blazed in the glow. Sealed in the dustless quiet of the cab, Rick Hammond steadied the wheel with one hand and punched coordinates into the touchscreen onboard computer with the other. With each new piece of data entered, the system let out a high-pitched beep or a low, lazy bloop. The reel of the harvester head spun steadily below like the paddle wheel of a river steamer, standing up stalks for the toothed blades cutting a dozen rows at a go. The feed auger corkscrewed the cut plants into the mouth of the combine, where a throbbing set of threshers splintered the dry pods, collecting the oily seeds inside and sending them spiraling up to the grain tank behind Rick's chair. Harvested beans ticked against the back window like a light summer hail. The only other sounds over the churning reel were the pong-like beeps from the computer. "Okay," Rick said at last, marking final coordinates. "We're on auto steer now." And to show me, he took his hands off the wheel. "I thought I'd be able to retire before I had to get auto steer," he sighed. Rick is in his 60s, tan and weather-worn, but still plenty fit. Most days he works sun up to sundown, especially during harvest. It wasn't the long hours, he said, were getting to be too much, but trying to keep up with the technology. The reason for all of this is inputs, he explained, the sort of catch-all term on the farm for anything that costs money. The combine continued along, following the contours of the planting lines automatically recorded months earlier by the global positioning system. As we moved, our progress was charted on the touchscreen in varying colors to show where each row or part of a row was above or below the target for bushels per acre for this field. All of that data is recorded and stored to plan for next year, helping farmers decide how to adjust the density of their seed populations, where to apply fertilizer, how much to water, where to put inputs, and where to save. During the era of high prices, yahoos that should have been broke were thinking, there's nothing to this farming game. Now we're back down to cost of production or less. So everything matters. Every place you can cut a corner or save, you do it. Even being out here was a tough call. Earlier in the day, with the sky clear and a light breeze blowing, Rick had asked Dave to check out the condition of the field. Dave just poked his nose in here to get the combine set, Rick said. He found that the soybeans were dry enough to harvest, but the ground, after weeks and weeks of rain, was so wet that bringing in all the equipment they'd need to work the field, the harvester, the tractor and grain cart, the semi to haul the beans away, was going to compact the soggy soil and make it too dense to plant next year. After some thought, Rick decided to make the sacrifice. It was scheduled to be seed corn next year, he said. But Pioneer had already informed its seed growers that the company would be further reducing fields from 30,000 acres in York County in 2013 down to 15,000 in 2015. We were scheduled for 6 fields, Rick said, but he expected that Pioneer would reduce that number by at least 1 field before planting came around in the spring. So I told them, you know what? If you're going to short us a field, this would be the one. The decision might seem impulsive. Why not wait just a few more days? But this urgency arises from a particular oddity of soybean biology. Beans are weird, Rick told me. With corn, he said, pointing to the stalks in the neighboring quarter, it's growing degree units, the heat. Then he pointed straight ahead to the horizon, the sun orange and sinking low. With beans, he said, it's sunlight. So unlike most crops, which begin to mature when the weather turns cold and the air dries, soybeans are short-day plants, meaning simply that their final stages of maturity are triggered by waning hours of sun. This poses two major problems when you run into an unusually wet fall. First, the days get shorter no matter what. Weather-dependent crops like corn slow their maturation on rainy days. You can get lucky, catch a warm spell or even a single sunny day and get out in the field and back on track. Not so with soybeans. While you're waiting for the clouds to clear, the beans are going past maturity. Second, soybeans have to be delivered to the grain elevator at a precisely defined moisture rate, 13%. We're at 12.9 right now, Rick said, showing me on the touchscreen. But when we get down there to where the ground is a little wetter, it'll go back up. Above 14%, he said, the grain elevator not only charges you for drying, but also docks you for the estimated shrinkage. And you would think, well, 1% of moisture would be 1% of shrink, Rick told me, but no, they dock you 1.5%. At 15%, they're apt to reject the whole load. So to make your best profit on soybeans, you need a sunny day, but not too sunny, with a dry breeze, but not too dry, and you need that day to fall exactly when the plant has received the precise number of hours, yes, hours, of sunlight from the moment you planted it months earlier. To make hitting such a tight window even remotely possible, seed companies like Rick's supplier DuPont Pioneer have hybridized soybeans for nearly a century and genetically modified them in recent decades according to bands of latitude, called maturity groupings. They number these photoregions from 0 in the northern growing zones of Canada up to 7 in the light-drenched flatlands of Florida. If you're lucky enough to have ground in the middle of a maturity grouping, then you can buy a single variety. But Nebraska, and Iowa too, I would note, is almost exactly divided between groups 2 and 3, the line bisecting the state into north and south, which means that farmers here, especially in central regions like York County, plant both varieties to spread out maturity, allowing them to harvest one group or another first, depending on the weather, and still get a consistent yield. But some daring farmers, like Rick, will formulate a guess as to what the weather holds for the growing season and plant more of one group or another, hoping for higher yields and higher returns. In 2014, after several years of drought, Rick bet on another dry year and planted incredibly short-season beans. While most of his neighbors were planting 3.5 maturity groupings, Rick had planted 2.4, and he was dead on, right up until the rain started in August. If he could have gotten out early ahead of farmers in other parts of the country and caught the market at its peak, he was positioned to make up for all the other setbacks going into harvest. But if you guessed right on the growing season, as Rick did, and then got an extremely wet fall, you could end up with hundreds of acres of mature soybeans and fields too wet to run the combine. With each storm that rolls up on the horizon, you move from making a hefty profit to incurring a crippling debt. Rick knew that prices would hold for a time on the chance of an unforeseen late-season catastrophe, a hedge against an ice storm freezing crops or a line of thunderheads dropping hail that could send prices skyrocketing. But as grain started pouring into the elevators, prices on futures were sure to slump. With the market already in free fall, some farmers had decided not to wait. They went out as soon as the mucky furrows would allow and used propane or electric dryers to deal with the high moisture grain. But this was yet another expense, and if the moisture levels were too high, the cost of drying could cancel any profit. Other farmers, like Rick, had held out as long as possible, but eventually everyone had to make hard choices. Every day that the beans sit out there, Rick said, you're under risk of a big, smashing storm. And then every day that we wait, the days get shorter and beans get harder and harder to get out because they just soak up moisture like crazy. And then the more that happens, when they're dry, wet, after they're mature, they're prone to shatter. They'll split wide open in a big wind. So when the rains finally let up, he decided it was time to go, soggy fields or no. It wasn't worth risking the return on this field this year just for the promise of above-market prices on seed corn next year. He had Dave set up the harvester, and he started across the field to judge for himself if the beans were ready. Now, halfway to the end of the swath, Rick checked the level of the grain tank. He needed to empty it out before he turned the combine and aimed back toward the barn and cluster of outbuildings on the eastern edge of the property. He radioed over to Kyle on the CB. "Can I dump on you?" Kyle pulled up alongside the combine with the tractor and grain cart moving in perfect parallel, while the harvesting reel kept spinning and the combine inched along across the field. The unloading auger arm started pouring out soybeans, sputtering and thrumming until the tank was empty, and Kyle peeled off to unload into the trailer of the big rig. Rick's mind was already back on the moisture levels. At the end of the swath, he took a wide sweeping turn and set the harvester back on auto steer. "This here is instant yield, instant moisture," Rick said, pointing to the screen, "and this is average yield, average moisture." As we moved, he could see in real time if he was on track to hit his production targets or falling short, and whether the moisture of the entire load was within the acceptable range or inching high enough that he'd have to pay a penalty for drying. We watched the data rolling across the screen, giving the minute-to-minute condition of the crop, like watching the stock market ticker rise and fall. The colors of our current 12 rows shifted back and forth, from green to yellow, from profit to loss. All the perils of modern farming seemed to crawl across that 4-inch screen with us. Thank you. I'm not sure what I need to do. Great, they've got it.
Thank you very much, Ted. So I'm kind of honing in on these introductions because one of the authors is a good friend of mine. Barb and I grew up together in Tipton, Iowa. Her mom's here. It's her birthday. Happy birthday, Jan. Wave your hand. Kathryn Gamble was born on the south side of Chicago, raised in Atlanta, lived in New York City before moving to Iowa in 2005. Kathryn earned her BA from the University of Georgia and also studied at the International Center of Photography in New York. Her commercial photography clients include the ACLU, Meredith Corporation, Sweet Paul Magazine, and Von Mauer. Barb Hall, a native Iowan, Tipton, Iowa, by the way, never lived on a farm, but was surrounded by farms. Barb, Tipton's not all that large, but has driven past hundreds of them, blissfully unaware about who owned the land or what they were doing with it. Barb has been writing stories since approximately age 10 and holds a journalism degree from Iowa State University. A former editor at Better Homes and Gardens magazine and other publications of Meredith Corporation, she has also worked in newspaper, advertising, and public relations. Please help me welcome our authors.
So, no, I want to start.
You want to start? Oh,
Okay,
okay.
because I didn't prepare anything, and I guess I'll just start by saying how this project came to be, and then Barb can read from it. So I heard a story on IPR about the fact that, I think at the time, it was 47% of Iowa farmland was owned by women. And not being a native Iowan, that really struck me because when I think of Iowa farmer, I think of an old guy in overalls and not women, just not what I imagined. And so I thought, I want to meet these women. I'm curious about who they are. What do they look like? What do their farms look like? What do they do? So being a commercial photographer, I didn't have time to go and spend a long time with them. Like, this was a beautiful portrait of family. The photographs were amazing. I had to drive there as fast as I could and size up the situation as fast as I could, take the picture as fast as I could, and drive home as fast as I could. So I just tried to do one heroic portrait of the women. Now, also in the start of this, this was an idea that I had, but if it were up to me, it would have never gone anywhere. I needed Barb. So Barb came in, she found the women, and called and bugged me and said, okay, this is the woman, when can we do it? And she would make me put it on the calendar, and then off we would go. So, that's it. That's it. That's all I have to say.
Well, Kathryn and I have been friends and worked together for, I don't even want to say how many years now, but we started working together when I was an editor at Meredith, and she was a beginning photographer, and we developed a very close bond. And she worked in Des Moines with me for a while, then went off to New York and got even better and better and better. And so when I was kind of kicked out of the profession about 10, 12 years ago, just between the demise of journalism and the economy, and I haven't worked as a writer, creator for almost 10 years. I've got other jobs that pay the bills. But when Kathryn said, would you be interested in working on this project with me? I said, yes, and just because it was Kathryn. So because I knew it would be great, no matter what it was. Like I said, I grew up in Iowa. I didn't really know that much about farming. I still really don't. People have been asking me questions about farming, and I'm like, I don't know. And Ted was lucky enough to take a really deep dive with one family, and that would be an amazing project. But we stuck our toes in the water with 26 amazing women, and we're getting lots of acclaim for this project. But really, the heroes are the women that are in this book, and several of them are with us today. Becky just came in, that's awesome. So I'm going to read a little bit from the chapters of the women that are in this area and that are here today. Oh, Morgan just came in, yay. Going to start with Susan Aram. Susan's here, stand up, Susan. She's right down the road in West Branch. This chapter is Cedar County, Growing Dirt, Susan Aram. We're going to change the landscape of Iowa. Susan Aram firmly believes that. You can see it in the lightning sparks that shoot from her steely blue eyes. And just as firmly, she believes it starts with the soil. As she explained this, she was working alongside her husband and two volunteers from Worldwide Opportunities on Organic Farms, WWOOF, in parentheses, layering materials to create a lasagna garden, a stratified collection of grass, cardboard, sheep manure, and wood chips. In 2 years, it will be healthy soil. We like to say we grow dirt here, she says, as she steps away for a moment to wipe her brow with a dusty brown glove. Susan first set foot on Iowa soil when she came to the University of Iowa from the East Coast in the early 1980s. I fell in love with Iowa, she says. In Iowa, when someone at the cash register asks you how you're doing today, they wait for an answer. That doesn't happen where I grew up. People are more patient and not so quick to speak their mind, which is a good way to be when you want to get along with folks your whole life. Morgan Honig just came in. Good timing, there she is back there. Henry County, the politics of produce, Morgan Honig. I don't have cable, I have bird feeders, laughs Morgan Honig, founder and owner of Mogo Organic, just outside her hometown of Mount Pleasant. Feeding the birds so regularly, however, might be more expensive than getting cable. Morgan says she goes through 100 pounds of birdseed a week, but she thinks it's worth the cost. If I keep them happy all winter, they'll stay to eat the bugs in the spring. Morgan has dreamed of growing and selling flowers and vegetables since she was a little girl, helping out in her parents' greenhouse and floral shop. She's now living that dream on the set of her earliest childhood memories, her grandfather's farm. Her grandfather, a local physician, had planned to retire on the land but died before that could happen in 1985, so the farm, buildings, and equipment sat unused until Morgan came along. I'm going to skip forward here. Morgan got a lot of media attention from President Obama's visit to her farm in 2010. It was my 10 minutes of fame, she says, but fame is not what she's about. She poo-poos her moment of glory, but she knows it was a big deal. I'm the only organic farmer in the area and female. It's Tom Vilsack's hometown, too, and so I was kind of an obvious choice. She says Obama was especially interested in her drip irrigation system and organic sprays she mixes herself. When the president comes to visit, it makes you realize that what you're doing is important. Jessica Stutzman was going to come today, but she had a family medical emergency out of state, so she's not here, but I'm going to read from her chapter because she's over in Hills. Johnson County, Growing a Legacy, Jessica Stutzman. As you stroll through the Iowa City Farmers Market, you encounter fresh produce in a rainbow of hues. Your nasal senses are tantalized by soaps, herbs, and prepared foods from a diverse variety of cultures. Tucked among the bounty are handmade rugs from a little place called Dirty Face Creek Farm, where Jessica Stutzman raises Angora goats, sheep, and llamas. She washes and prepares the fleece by hand, then spins it and weaves it into rugs. Most of the fibers in her rugs are left in their natural hues, but for variety, Jessica dyes some of them with natural colorants like indigo, marigold, and black walnuts from the farm. Let's see, I'm going to skip over. Okay. A native Ohioan, Jessica started her academic career in literature and women's studies at Bowling Green, but she came to realize that she really wanted to work outside, with dirt. Her dreams took her to the Pacific Northwest, where she worked for the Washington Conservation Corps, Washington Forest Service, and U.S. Geological Survey. While she was there, she met an Iowa farmer, Mike Stutzman, who married her and brought her home to his family land near the town of Hills. Mike had always dreamed of growing organic food for a nonprofit, and in 2005, the pair began the 3-year process of certifying some of his parents' land for organic production. 3 months after sending the paperwork in 2008, Mike was killed in a combine accident. Their daughter, Sophie, was 3 months old. Let's see, I'm going to skip ahead again. Jessica would like to buy 20 more acres to certify organic. With Sophie now in school, Jessica can begin to dedicate herself to that effort, which she knows can take years. Dirty Face Creek Farm got its name from the dirty faces of children playing when the area was first settled. Jessica hopes to stand one day on the front porch with Sophie and shout, "Dirty Face Creek ain't dirty no more." And we also have our Iowa cricket farmer here today, Becky Herman, back there in the back with her little girl, and she's wearing her sweatshirt, which is awesome. Benton County, Jiminy Crickets? Becky Herman. The typical Iowa farmer spends hours every day doing chores. For Becky Herman, it's more like 15 minutes in the morning and a half hour in the evening. But she's not raising hogs, cattle, or turkeys. She's growing another source of protein, crickets. A high school teacher in Marion, Becky first heard about cricket farming on a CNN news feed that she watches every day with her students. "I saw it 3 times in one day," she recalls. "The first time I thought, that's interesting. By the 3rd time I saw it, I knew it was something I needed to research." Research she did. Insect protein is something we haven't really tapped, she says. For Becky, the environmental benefits are the most appealing aspects of crickets. It's 200 times more efficient in water use than other sources of protein. In her research, Becky also found that for the same amount of protein, crickets require half as much feed as pigs and chickens, and 12 times less than cattle. Becky also discovered that 70% of our freshwater resources go to raising traditional livestock. The United Nations is predicting that those resources will decrease by 40% by the year 2030, which is a major reason why we chose crickets. And now we have time for questions. Questions for either us or any of the women that are here? We'd love to involve them in the session.
Or Ted.
And, oh, yeah. I meant, when I said us, I meant Ted.
Can I have a microphone because we're taking this so we can share it with other people? So if you have a question, raise your hand, and I will bring you the microphone. And I lived for a while in Africa and ate crickets, and they're not bad at all.
My question was about the crickets. Do you have a market for those, or what happens to the crickets after you produce them?
I'll hold up the picture of the crickets.
You would be surprised. There is actually a booming market for insects right now. In North America, in 2015, it was a $20 million industry, and it's only growing. It's a good problem to have. We cannot actually even begin to fill the void. So it's growing, and we'd like to get bigger as well.
Great source of protein. Other questions? And
you didn't see the incredible photography of
Yeah,
the
I'm sorry
women in the
about that.
land.
I didn't-
So you'll just all have to buy the book, which is for sale in the lobby.
Yeah,
was
I
the
think there are
plan.
some out there, and there are some down the street at Merge also, but it was too wet to carry books before the thing started, so we didn't get the books here. I'll just start flipping through the pages while we answer questions.
I want to know, do you make cricket meatloaf or do you work it into things?
Yeah, but you have to do it into the mic. So I can tell I ate lots of different insects and grubs, and you can do amazing things with them. My best story is there was a termite mound in front of our house, and you just caught the termites live as they flew out and ate them, and they were kind of like popcorn, only they didn't have butter on them. So here you go.
So again, in North America, we're not used to eating bugs, you know. Don't really prefer to eat bugs. So what they do is they grind them into a cricket flour, and then they can bake with the flour. Now, it's really more of a protein powder, so it's not one-to-one, like you can't use it like you would use regular flour, and it's a lot more expensive than regular flour. But you can get protein, a lot of protein, and that's kind of, I mean, that's where the health market is involved. That's why a lot of people, we say crickets are the new kale. You know, a lot of people are really into bugs and how to cook with those. But you're right, popcorn, if you're going to eat them in that state, they kind of taste like that.
When I first met Becky, she had a bag of cricket snacks with her, and she handed me the bag and said, "Go ahead, try some." And I reached in and grabbed some, and I would have been totally okay if I hadn't have looked at them before I put them in my mouth. But they really weren't. They were crunchy and salty.
So I'm going to ask you a question, Ted, while we're waiting to get over here. How is the family doing that you wrote about?
Well, they're doing fine in the sense that, you know, I think many families are doing fine right now, which is to say that they're getting by incurring debt. And I think, you know, one of the messages that I've been trying to get out to people is that we've actually just crossed the threshold now where there's more farm debt in the United States now than there has been at any time since the farm crisis. And what that means is that you know, the only way that debt gets serviced and continues to you know, to be a loan as opposed to a defaulted loan is if the income keeps coming in to make those payments. And with the farm income being down about 50% in the last few years, all of the sort of standing support that the government has given to farmers is more critical than ever. And that comes in the form of trade deals, and it comes in the form of subsidies and crop insurance, and also rural development dollars. And the current administration has earmarked the elimination of rural development dollars and severe cuts to crop insurance and subsidies. And obviously with talking about scrapping or dramatically renegotiating NAFTA and scrapping plan deals like TPP, there's a real threat of crisis, I would say, right now on all the farms. And so everyone is hanging on, but I think it's a really precarious moment.
So my question is for Ted. I don't know if you have a farming background, so I want to know what fact most startled you when you were working with a family. Thank
Sure.
you.
Yeah, thank you. I should have explained, my family have been farmers in Nebraska for 150 years. And my dad, who's the family genealogist, always complains that when he goes looking for information, there's a birth date, there's a death date, and in between, there's nothing but, you know, scratching in the dirt someplace in Nebraska. He grew up on a series of farms when he was a kid. The land that didn't belong to our family but had been farmed by our family for many years was lost during the Depression and pushed my family to western Nebraska, where my dad grew up. And my dad said that, you know, he spent his entire childhood watching his dad fretting as any storm formed on the horizon, because, you know, a hailstorm could come through and wipe out a crop. And as a tenant farmer, if the crop had been damaged, they were no longer needed, and one big storm and they were out and looking for someplace new to live and work. And so my dad said, you know, that when he turned 18, he couldn't get out of there fast enough and never looked back. But when I was a kid and we were visiting family who were still farming, I was always sort of, I guess, intrigued by this language that my dad was able to speak with other members of the family that it was like a foreign language to me. And so, you know, kids rebel in all sorts of strange ways. My way of rebelling was to get interested in what was going on with agriculture. But the thing that I found surprising, because when I was a kid, was really the last time that I had sort of sustained exposure to, especially to row crop farming. Things were still not nearly as mechanized and automated as they are now. And the thing that I think most of us don't realize is that the goal of the big companies, especially the big equipment companies who are now on the brink of merging with the big seed companies, which have already merged with the big chemical companies, the goal, and they talk about it in these terms, is farmerless farms. And we are already at a point where there are automated planters that are being tested, that you need a crew that brings them up to the edge of the field and then they just go on their own, and are making decisions based on data that's been entered, that's been collected and crunched from years past. There are automated sprayers that are in the fields now that are applying herbicides, pesticides, depending on what's been programmed in. And also we're in the early stages of fully automated center pivot systems. And when we reach a point where you don't need a farmer to plant, to apply the inputs, to irrigate the crops, or to harvest, we're rapidly approaching that farmerless farm. I mean, I think it's probably less than 10 years away. And what that will mean for farms going forward, I think, is an open question. The thing that I would say almost certainly is true is that it will mean even more depopulation of rural areas.
Well, that made me want to ask you how many farmers there are and how many jobs that we're looking at for a loss.
Right, yeah, so, it all depends on when you measure from, of course, what the loss is. But to me, the kind of measuring point, and this probably just speaks to my frame of reference, but starting from the farm crisis to the present, the number of farmers off the land is about 75%, and talking about Great Plains states. And so, of course, what that's led to is this cycle of consolidation and also then, as I said, the automation. And those things just kind of feed each other. As there's less labor available, there's more of a market for automated equipment. And as there's more automated equipment, there's less need for hand labor. And so, you see this sort of trend of depopulation. The thing I can tell you, and I've gotten in a lot of hot water for saying this around Nebraska. Nobody wants to, but I went on national radio and said that everything west of Lincoln was disappearing, and everybody got mad. But the reality is that west of Lincoln to Denver in Nebraska, every single county is losing population, all of them. And so that's, I mean, that's the trend. And the population density, when you reach up into the Dakotas and down into Kansas, there's a block there of about 100,000 square miles that has fewer than 1 million people. And that same population density stretches up then to the west, up into Wyoming and Montana and so on. And that's a trend that's just not going to reverse itself. That part of the country is losing population. And, you know, the objective is for all of the farming that is carried out in that part of the country to be as fully automated as possible. So to me, the real question is what it means for some of these plain states when you have large urban centers and then completely empty agricultural areas. And, you know, I don't think we've really reckoned with the reality of that yet. I mean, there's still a kind of romance of the rural area, but the reality is that it's extremely difficult. And I think, I mean, I completely understand the decision that my father made. It's the same decision I would make if he had still been on the farm. I mean, it's an incredibly difficult life with constant stress and only marginal gains. And it's still a case where, you know, one major setback and you could lose generations worth of work. It's not how I would choose to live.
I think we have time for one more question here.
There's another one here.
Oh, two more questions. Susan, you go.
So I'm just going to quick ask, so it seems like as we get more and more mechanized, we're going to be relying on more and more chemicals and having worse water quality. Would you say that to be the trend for the future? Because they're not paying attention to the soil.
Yeah, certainly, I mean, Iowa is a case study of all the things that can go wrong with water quality. And I mean, I don't say that jokingly. I mean, it really is a cautionary tale for the rest of the country that the majority of farm states are ignoring. I mean, to me, there's a really complicated set of issues going on in that the seed companies are constantly engineering new kinds of seeds that are intended to reduce chemical usage, which, if that's where it stopped, I think we could have a debate about whether that's beneficial or not. But it's never where it stops. That always enables new applications of chemicals and new seeds to be engineered. I don't know how many of you are familiar with dicamba, but dicamba is like the current example of this, where Monsanto said, we've got a new super herbicide that, you know, will kill everything if you've got this dicamba resistant crop. And people who got the dicamba resistant soybeans went out, sprayed, and the dicamba didn't have the grip, as they call it in the industry, that it was supposed to, and it drifted onto neighboring fields and killed everybody's crops on neighboring fields, along with everything else, trees and everything else. Yeah, but the EPA just yesterday cleared the way that to speed up the approval of new kinds of dicamba and new varieties of seeds that are resistant to dicamba. And so it works out great for Monsanto that all of a sudden, you know, if your neighbors are applying dicamba, you can't grow soybeans that are not resistant to dicamba. And you have to buy their product.
Maybe we can end on an up note.
Yes, that'd be great.
Susan Aram from Sustainable Iowa Land Trust. I'd like to suggest a third option to major metro areas and empty fields, which is we are currently facing a $180 billion land transfer in Iowa alone in the next 20 years. And this is our opportunity to define what the landscape will look like, so we can sit back and keep buying our Cheetos or we can continue to support our local farmers like Morgan, or even start eating crickets, and change the face of the landscape back to a more diversified landscape that doesn't require chemicals, that operates on the wisdom of the old with the technology of today, and actually provides jobs and actually brings young people back to our rural communities, at least those surrounding our metro areas. It's possible, it's happening. Iowa is actually ranked, what, 4th now in states with the number of organic farms. We can give a lot of that to the Amish, but we can also give a lot to the young people like Morgan, who are out there doing the hard work. So it's not all over. There's not just one kind of farming in this country. We are importing almost 90% of our food to Iowa. We can change that. And when we keep those dollars in Iowa and we eat our own food and grow our own food, we're going to be creating jobs and opportunity and cleaning our waters and our soils. But thank you all for what you're doing, because you're helping amplify the issue.
So thank you all very, very much. Thank you all for coming. The books are for sale in the lobby. If you'd like to have them sign them, I'm sure they'd be willing to do that. And there's a lot more to see and hear today. So if you need a program, we have them here. There is a book fair next door at Merge. And have a great day, and stay dry or stay wet, depending on what you want to do.